Working as a librarian wasn't exactly my dream job, but it paid the bills, and I liked the quiet. Fairhaven was a sleepy little town where not much ever happened, and that suited me just fine. The library itself was ancient, built in the early 1900s, with tall, narrow windows and creaky wooden floors that groaned every time you moved. I spent most days sorting books, helping the occasional patron find a title, or just sitting behind the counter reading whatever caught my eye. The basement, though? I avoided it. It wasn't that it was creepy, though it kind of was. The single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling barely lit the room, casting long shadows over rows of dusty shelves filled with old newspapers and forgotten archives. The air was always damp, smelling faintly of mildew and ink. But the real reason I stayed away was simple. There was no reason to go down there. At least that's what I thought. One slow Thursday afternoon, I got a call from Mrs. Harper, one of our regulars. She'd been looking for a book about local history, and was convinced it was buried somewhere in the basement archives. I tried to argue that the book was probably checked out or misfiled, but she insisted. So down I went. The steps creaked under my weight as I descended, my flashlight flickering against the uneven stone walls. Most of the shelves were covered in dust, the labels faded to the point of being unreadable. I was halfway through the second row when I felt it, a faint draft against the back of my neck. It didn't make sense. There were no windows or vents down here, and the basement was sealed tighter than a drum. I turned around, shining my flashlight toward the corner of the room. That's when I saw it. A thin line of light outlined what looked like a doorway. It was barely noticeable, hidden behind a shelf that seemed bolted to the wall. My first instinct was to ignore it. I didn't get paid enough to mess with secret doors or whatever nonsense this was, but curiosity got the better of me. I moved the shelf aside, surprisingly easy, given how heavy it looked, and there it was, a narrow wooden door with an old-fashioned iron handle. I hesitated for a moment before twisting the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a room I hadn't known existed. It was small, barely bigger than a closet, with walls lined floor to ceiling with books. No dust, no mildew, just rows of pristine leather-bound volumes that didn't belong to any catalog I'd ever seen. I stepped inside, the air feeling heavier somehow. The titles on the spines weren't just unfamiliar. They were names. Richard Malone, one read. Margaret Hensley, said another. I frowned, running my fingers over the spines. These weren't just random names. They were people from Fairhaven. I recognized some of them. Neighbors, shopkeepers, even a few kids who went to the high school. My stomach twisted as I pulled out a book at random. The pages were filled with dense handwritten text. It wasn't just a story. It was a detailed account of someone's life. Everything from mundane daily routines to deeply personal moments was laid out with eerie precision. And then I got to the last few pages. They described the person's death, not in vague terms either. It was graphic, exact, right down to the date and time. My hands started to shake as I read. The person in the book had died 3 days ago, in a car accident that matched every detail written on the page. I shoved the book back onto the shelf, my heart pounding. This couldn't be real, but I couldn't stop myself. I reached for another book, then another. Each one was the same. A life meticulously recorded, ending with a death that felt inevitable. And then I saw it, a book with my name on the spine. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the book with my name on it. My fingers itched to grab it, but something deep in my gut screamed not to. This was a mistake. Whatever this room was, whatever these books were, it wasn't something I should be messing with. But curiosity got the better of me. It always does. With trembling hands, I pulled the book off the shelf. It felt heavier than it should have, like the weight of it was more than just paper and leather. My name, Philippe Donovan, was embossed on the cover in gold lettering. It gleamed under the dim light of my flashlight. I opened it, my breath catching as I flipped through the pages. The handwriting was neat, almost mechanical, like it had been written by a machine. The first few pages were innocuous enough, detailing things I barely remembered. Graduating college, my first day working at the library, conversations I'd had with my mom. But the further I read, the more personal it got. There were moments in there I'd never told anyone about. The argument I'd had with my father before he passed, the time I stole a book from a store as a teenager, even the exact wording of a breakup I'd gone through years ago. My heart pounded as I flipped closer to the end, dreading what I'd find. The last few pages, however, were blank. I stared at them, the pristine white paper almost mocking me. Why was mine unfinished when everyone else's seemed complete? I was about to close the book when something strange happened. Words began to appear on the blank page. Slowly, like they were being written in real time. Felipe closed the book and took a shaky breath, his mind racing with questions he couldn't answer. I gasped, almost dropping the book. I looked down at the page again, my hands trembling. He glanced around the room, feeling the weight of the discovery pressing down on him, and stepped back toward the doorway. "What the hell?" I whispered, taking a step back as if the book itself were alive. The words matched exactly what I'd just done. I tested it, moving my hand to touch the wall beside me. New words appeared instantly. Felipe's hand brushed against the cold stone wall as his breathing quickened. I slammed the book shut, my mind reeling. This couldn't be real. There was no way. I turned to leave the room, but something caught my eye. Another book lying open on the table in the center of the room. It wasn't there before. I approached it cautiously, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The book was massive, its pages filled with rows of names and dates, some crossed out, others circled. At the bottom of the open page was a name I recognized, Rebecca Caldwell. Rebecca was a regular at the library, always borrowing romance novels and chatting about her garden. My stomach twisted as I scanned the rest of the entry. It detailed her life up until now, but the last entry was different. Rebecca Caldwell will die tomorrow at 7:42 p.m., slipping on wet tiles outside the grocery store. I slammed the book shut, bile rising in my throat. This had to be some kind of elaborate prank, right? But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I couldn't just ignore it. If this was real, if it was predicting her death, I had to do something. The next day, I waited outside the grocery store, my heart racing as I checked the time on my phone. Rebecca walked out, her bag of groceries in hand, just like the book had said. The tiles were wet from the rain earlier that afternoon, and I saw it before it happened. The way her foot slipped, the way she fell backward toward the curb. "Rebecca!" I shouted, rushing forward. I managed to grab her arm, stopping her just before she hit the ground. She looked shaken but unharmed, thanking me profusely as I helped her steady herself. For a moment I felt relief. I'd stopped it. I'd beaten whatever this was. But that relief didn't last long. As Rebecca crossed the parking lot to her car, a truck sped through the lot, its driver distracted by their phone. I could only watch as the truck slammed into her, throwing her body against the pavement. The sound was sickening. I stood there, frozen, as people screamed and ran toward her. My phone slipped from my hand, hitting the ground with a dull thud. It was worse than the book had described. Much worse. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Rebecca, her body crumpled on the pavement, the horrified look on her face in those final moments. I kept replaying it in my head, over and over, trying to figure out if I'd done the right thing by intervening. But deep down, I knew the truth. The book hadn't been wrong. I hadn't saved Rebecca. I'd only made it worse. The next morning, I sat in the library, staring at the book with my name on it. It sat there on the desk, silent and innocent, as though it hadn't just shattered everything I believed about the world. The words from the day before were still there, perfectly detailed. Felipe watched Rebecca walk away, unaware of the truck barreling toward her. My chest tightened as I turned the page. New words appeared as I read them. Felipe couldn't ignore the pull of the room in the basement. He knew he had to go back. "No," I muttered, slamming the book shut. But even as I said it, I felt the pull. The room had answers. It had to. I grabbed the book and headed downstairs, my footsteps echoing in the silence. When I opened the hidden door, the room felt different. The air was colder, heavier, and the shelves seemed taller, looming over me like silent sentinels. I set my book down on the central table, my hands shaking as I flipped to the last blank page. "I won't let this happen," I whispered to myself. "I won't let it control me." The room seemed to respond, the air humming faintly. The book lay open, its pages blank and waiting. I grabbed a pen from my pocket and hesitated, my mind racing. If the book could write my actions, maybe I could write them instead. Maybe I could take control. With a trembling hand, I wrote, "Felipe discovers how to destroy the books." The words shimmered on the page, and for a moment I thought it had worked. But then, almost mockingly, the book wrote back. Felipe's pen dropped as the truth eluded him. "The books cannot be destroyed." I threw the pen across the room, the sound echoing like a gunshot. The books on the shelves seemed to tremble, their spines vibrating as though laughing at me. "Fine," I growled. "If I can't destroy you, I'll burn you." I grabbed my book and stormed back upstairs, grabbing a lighter from my desk drawer. My hands were steady now, driven by anger and desperation. If the book couldn't exist, it couldn't control me. I struck the lighter and held the flame to the edge of the book. The paper curled and blackened, the fire spreading quickly. For a moment, I felt triumphant. But then I looked down at my hands. They were fading. "No," I whispered, stumbling back. My legs felt weak, my chest hollow. I turned to the mirror behind the counter, and my reflection was disappearing. My face, my body, it was like watching a photo slowly erase itself. The fire burned through the last page of the book, and with it, the air in the room shifted. Everything around me blurred, like ink running on wet paper. I wasn't in the library anymore. I don't remember how I started writing. One moment, I was clutching the quill, and the next, the words flowed from me like water. The book in front of me filled itself, line by line, the letters appearing as though I'd always known what to write. The names came first, dozens of them, each more familiar than the last. People from the town, Mrs. Harper, Rebecca Caldwell, even the barista from the coffee shop I visited every Sunday. The pages chronicled their lives, their joys, their sorrows, and their ends. I tried to stop, to drop the quill, but my hand wouldn't obey. It moved on its own, gliding across the page with a precision that wasn't mine. "No," I whispered, "this isn't me, I don't want this." The figure in the shadows appeared again, silent and still, watching as I struggled against the invisible force driving me. "You cannot fight it," it said, its voice calm but cold. "You are part of the library now." "I didn't choose this," I shouted, my voice cracking. The figure tilted its head, the faintest hint of amusement in its tone. "You burned the book. You severed your tie to the living world. There is no going back." Tears blurred my vision as I looked down at the book. The words were mine, but they felt alien, as if someone else had reached inside me and pulled them out. And then I saw my name. It was written again and again, interwoven with the others, as if my life was just one thread in a tapestry of endless stories. I turned to the figure, desperation clawing at my chest. If I'm writing their lives, I can change them, right? I can stop the tragedies. The figure stepped closer, its form shifting like smoke. "You can try, but every change you make will ripple outward, creating new tragedies in its wake. This is the burden of the author." I shook my head, gripping the quill tighter. "No, I can fix it. I'll make it right." Without waiting for a response, I flipped to Rebecca Caldwell's page. The image of her death burned into my memory. The words describing her final moments glared back at me, unyielding. With trembling hands, I crossed them out. For a moment, the room grew silent. The air seemed lighter, and I felt the faintest flicker of hope. But then the walls around me shuddered, the books on the shelves trembling as though in anger. The text on Rebecca's page rewrote itself, faster and more horrifying than before. "Rebecca Caldwell will survive the parking lot accident, only to be struck by lightning a week later." "No!" I screamed, scratching out the new words. But they returned, more vivid, more terrible, each edit twisting her fate into something worse. The figure watched, unmoving, as I tried again and again to rewrite the story, each attempt unraveling into chaos. "This is the truth you sought to destroy," it said. "You cannot change what is written without consequence." I collapsed onto the table, the quill slipping from my fingers. My hands shook as the reality of my new existence settled over me. "What happens if I stop writing?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The figure's response was immediate. "The stories stop, their lives unravel. The library exists to ensure the balance is maintained. Without you, there is nothing." I stared at the book in front of me, the ink still wet on the pages. The weight of it was unbearable, but the alternative was worse. "Fine," I said, my voice hollow. "I'll write, but only what's already there. I won't try to change anything." The figure stepped back into the shadows, its form fading until only its voice remained. "For now, but every author starts the same. In time, you will understand." The room grew quiet again, the hum of the library settling into a steady rhythm. I picked up the quill, my hand steadier than I expected, and began to write once more. The names came easily now, each one a thread in the tapestry. The lives I chronicled were vibrant and full, but their ends were always the same, inevitable, unchangeable. And then I saw it. At the edge of the ledger, faint but unmistakable, was a new name, Philippa Donovan. The ink spread slowly, detailing a life I no longer remembered, each word cementing my place in the library's endless cycle. As I wrote, I felt myself fading further, becoming one with the pages, my existence woven into the stories I created. By the time I finished, I wasn't sure where I ended and the library began. I stood in the center of the hidden room, but it was different now. The walls were darker, the shelves towering infinitely upward. The table was gone, replaced by a massive ledger that glowed faintly in the dim light. I felt a presence behind me and turned slowly. There was a figure there, cloaked in shadows, its face obscured. It held a quill in one skeletal hand, dipping it into an inkwell that seemed to shimmer with stars. You shouldn't have done that, it said, its voice low and hollow. What is this place? I stammered. The Library of Lives, it said simply. The record of all that is, was, and will be. I took a shaky step back. I didn't ask for this. I just wanted to stop it, to change it. The figure tilted its head as if amused. You cannot change what is written. You can only add to it. I looked down at my hands. They were still faint, translucent, but I could move them. What happens to me now? The figure extended the quill toward me. You become what all who interfere must. An author. I shook my head, my breath hitching. No, I can't. You already have. The table reappeared in front of me, and on it was a book. My book. But the pages weren't empty anymore. They were filled with dense, intricate handwriting that wasn't mine. The figure gestured to the quill. It is time to continue the work. My hands moved without my control, reaching for the quill. The moment my fingers touched it, the room grew impossibly bright, and I felt a weight settle over me, heavy, eternal, and then I began to write. When I first moved to Oak Ridge, Ohio, I didn't think much of it. Small town, quiet streets, and an office space that came dirt cheap. It felt like the perfect place to start over. After all, being a therapist in New York City had been draining. I was burned out from the constant buzz, the never-ending demand for my time, and the strain it put on my family. Oak Ridge promised something simpler, something quieter, or so I thought. The building where I set up my new practice wasn't anything special, but it had character. The kind of old-school charm you'd find in towns like this. Creaky wooden floors, tall windows, and the faint smell of varnish that never quite goes away. It was an old Victorian structure, probably built in the late 1800s. The real estate agent had told me it had been home to various businesses over the decades, most recently another therapist's office. I figured that was a good sign. Continuity, familiarity. I didn't ask too many questions. My wife, Claire, and our 2 kids, Maddie and Jake, helped me settle in. We spent the better part of a weekend unpacking boxes, hanging degrees on the walls, and making the office feel more like mine. Maddie found a tiny key in one of the desk drawers, but I didn't think anything of it at the time. Just one of those odd little leftovers you find in places with a lot of history. I tossed it in a box and forgot about it. My first day of sessions started off normal. A couple of locals had booked appointments, a woman struggling with post-divorce anxiety, a teenager dealing with the pressures of high school, routine stuff. But my last appointment of the day, that's where everything started to get strange. Jeremy Coleman was a lanky guy in his mid-20s with dark circles under his eyes and a nervous energy that filled the room. He sat on the edge of the couch, bouncing his knee up and down, barely meeting my eyes. It's like, I don't know how to explain it, he started, his voice shaky. It's like someone's stealing my memories. I leaned forward, pen poised over my notebook. Stealing your memories? Can you give me an example? He hesitated, raking his hands through his messy hair. Yeah, like yesterday I went to visit my mom. I remember walking up to her front door, but when I knocked, she wasn't there. Only thing is, I don't know why she wasn't there. Did I get the day wrong? Did she tell me she was going somewhere? I don't remember, I can't fill in the gaps. I nodded, trying to piece together what he was saying. And this has been happening for how long? A couple of months, maybe. It's getting worse, though. Like I'll forget where I put my keys or why I walked into a room. Normal stuff, right? But then I'll realize I can't remember my best friend's birthday or what I ate for breakfast last week. Big stuff is slipping away, too. He paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. Sometimes I feel like it's not even me forgetting. Like someone's taking it from me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I'd heard plenty of stories from patients that didn't add up. Stress does weird things to the mind. But there was something about the way he said it. It wasn't just fear. It was desperation. Like he was drowning and no one could throw him a lifeline. I know it sounds crazy, Jeremy added quickly, his eyes darting toward the door. But it's real. I feel it. There's something inside me. I didn't know how to respond to that. I jotted down some notes, trying to sound calm. Okay, let's work through this together. Maybe it's stress or some sort of trauma you've been carrying around. It's not that, he interrupted. It's something else. It's alive. The session ended awkwardly, with Jeremy leaving as jittery as when he'd arrived. I tried not to let his words stick with me, but they did. That night, after everyone had gone home, I stayed behind to organize the office. I thought about calling Claire to tell her I'd be late, but I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. The empty office was unnervingly quiet. While cleaning out one of the old desk drawers, my hand brushed against something hard. It was a book, a leather-bound journal, dusty and worn. Curious, I opened it. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, like the author had been scribbling in a rush. It belonged to a therapist who had worked here decades ago. The first few entries were mundane, documenting patients and small-town gossip, but then the tone shifted. One entry in particular caught my attention. They feed on us. Memories are their sustenance. If you feel them, it's already too late. My stomach turned. I closed the journal and shoved it back in the drawer. It was just a coincidence, I told myself. Just someone else's attempt to explain something unexplainable. But the words stuck with me. And when I finally turned off the lights and locked the office, I couldn't shake the feeling that Jeremy wasn't as delusional as he seemed. The next few weeks at the office passed in a blur, but Jeremy's words stuck with me. It's alive. No matter how many times I told myself he was just another anxious young man trying to make sense of his world, something about his desperation didn't sit right. And then, there were the others. It wasn't just Jeremy anymore. A handful of my patients, ordinary people with ordinary problems, began describing similar issues. Little lapses at first. A mom of 3 couldn't remember the name of her youngest son's teacher, even though she'd met her a dozen times. A retired cop forgot the exact year he had retired. They all dismissed it as stress, aging, or lack of sleep. But as their stories piled up, so did my unease. By the end of the month, I was noticing gaps in my own memory. It started small, forgetting where I put my car keys, blanking on a few names during a session, but quickly escalated. One morning I drove Maddie to her dance class and forgot how to get back home. I took a wrong turn, then another, until the neighborhood looked completely unfamiliar. I had to pull over and check the GPS on my phone, my hands shaking as I punched in my own address. Long day, I guess, I mumbled to Claire that evening, brushing it off, but the worry in her eyes said she wasn't buying it. The next day I decided to spend some time digging into the journal I'd found in the desk. If I'm being honest, I wasn't expecting much. Maybe the previous therapist had been eccentric or even paranoid, but the deeper I read, the more unsettling it became. The entries grew more erratic, filled with fragmented sentences and pages of frantic scribbles. One entry read, "It's in the walls. It's in me. I tried to leave, but it keeps pulling me back." Another, "They don't take everything at once, little by little until there's nothing left." The journal had a name scrawled across the inside cover, Dr. Raymond Ellis. I decided to look him up that evening, thinking I'd find some explanation. A disgraced license, maybe, or a history of mental health issues. What I found was worse. Dr. Ellis had vanished nearly 40 years ago. No explanation, no trace. According to a few archived newspaper articles, his patients had filed complaints about him losing focus during sessions, forgetting their names, or appearing disoriented. Sounded familiar. When I asked around town, most people just shrugged it off. Oak Ridge wasn't the kind of place where folks clung to the past. But there was one person who had plenty to say. Martha Bell, an elderly woman who had worked as a janitor at the building for decades. "You're in that office now?" she asked, her tone sharp. I nodded. Her thin lips pressed together as she glanced around, as if checking for eavesdroppers. "You should leave. That place has always had something wrong with it." "What do you mean?" I pressed, trying not to sound as desperate as I felt. "I mean, it takes things from people," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "First little things, your keys, your glasses, your sense of time. Then it starts taking the bigger things." She didn't elaborate, but her words made my stomach churn. On the drive back to the office, I told myself she was just a superstitious old woman with too much time to think. Still, as I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the space felt different, heavier. That night, after my last session, the lights flickered. Just a quick flicker, like old wiring acting up, but enough to make my pulse race. I chalked it up to an electrical issue and got back to work, but the room felt colder than usual. Then came the whispering. At first I thought it was the wind. The building creaked and groaned sometimes, so it wasn't unusual to hear odd noises. But this was different. Low, almost inaudible murmurs like voices coming from somewhere just out of reach. I walked through the office, checking each room. Nothing. Still, the feeling of being watched was unbearable. I locked up early that night, heading home with my nerves shot. At dinner, Claire asked if I was okay. "You've been distracted lately," she said, cutting into her chicken. I wanted to tell her about the journal, about Jeremy, about the whispers, but it sounded insane, even to me. Instead, I shook my head, just getting used to the new routine. That night, I couldn't sleep. The words from the journal looped in my mind. They don't take everything at once. What was it taking from me? When I returned to the office the next day, I noticed something new. Jeremy's file was sitting on my desk, even though I distinctly remembered filing it away. A sticky note was attached to the front. Ask him about the dreams. I didn't write that note. My stomach dropped. When I called Jeremy later that day, he answered on the second ring. Dreams? He repeated, his voice laced with confusion. What dreams? I had no idea what to say. Have you been having any unusual dreams since we started your sessions? There was a long pause. Then, yeah, actually. I dream about the office, about sitting in your chair, but I'm not alone. There's someone else there, watching. The line went dead before I could ask more. I stared at the phone, a cold sweat breaking out across my back. As the sun set that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about Jeremy, or any of my patients. Whatever this was, it was connected to me now. Running wasn't going to help, and deep down, I wasn't sure if I even remembered how to leave. By the time I unlocked the office door the next morning, I was running on fumes. Sleep had been out of the question. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those shadows Jeremy mentioned, standing behind me, watching, waiting. The air in the office felt heavier than ever, like the weight of the building was pressing down on my chest. I tried to shake it off and focus on my schedule for the day. Routine had to help, right? It didn't. My first patient, Mrs. Taylor, couldn't remember why she'd made the appointment. She just sat there, staring at me with wide, blank eyes. I thought, maybe you could remind me, she said, her voice trembling. I flipped through my notes, but they were scattered, incomplete. I didn't even remember writing them. I mumbled something about general stress and wrapped up the session early. After she left, I sat at my desk staring at the journal. I hadn't touched it since the night I found Jeremy's name in its pages, but now it felt like my only lead. My hands trembled as I flipped to the last few entries. I tried to fight it. It doesn't stop. It feeds. It grows. If you feel it, it's already inside you. My stomach churned. Was this thing already in me? I tried to focus, to ground myself in the moment. Claire, Maddie, Jake, their faces, their voices. But when I closed my eyes, their images were blurry, like photographs left out in the rain. The whispering started again. It wasn't the wind this time. It was louder, clearer, like voices overlapping just out of reach. I stood up, heart pounding, and walked toward the sound. It led me to the corner of the waiting room, where the wallpaper was peeling slightly. I pressed my hand against the wall. It was cold, too cold. I could feel a faint vibration, like something alive was pulsing beneath the surface. Hello? My voice cracked. The whispers stopped. The silence was worse. I stepped back, but before I could move farther, the lights flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for my phone. The glow of the screen illuminated the space just enough to show the shadows creeping across the walls. They moved unnaturally, stretching and twisting, like they were alive. "Who's there?" I shouted, but the words felt small, swallowed by the weight of the room. The shadows didn't answer. Instead, they swirled together, coalescing into a figure, tall, amorphous, and humming with something that felt like hunger. I froze, my legs refusing to move. It spoke without words, the sound reverberating inside my skull. "You've seen too much." My knees buckled as images flooded my mind. Memories of patients sitting in my office, their faces twisting in confusion as pieces of themselves were taken. Jeremy, Mrs. Taylor, even me. It wasn't just feeding on them. It was feeding on all of us. "No," I whispered, clutching my head. You can't stop me." I don't know how I found the strength, but I stumbled back to my desk and grabbed the journal. I tore through the pages, desperate for anything that could help. My fingers landed on a single phrase, scrawled in shaky handwriting. "Remember who you are." The thing laughed, or at least that's what it felt like. A cold, mocking vibration that shook the room. My memories felt like sand slipping through my fingers. Claire's smile, Maddie's laughter, Jake's tiny hand in mine. I was losing them. "No!" I shouted, slamming the journal down on the desk. "You don't get to take them from me!" I forced myself to focus on the details. The day Maddie was born, the smell of Claire's perfume, the way Jake used to run into my arms after school. I clung to those moments, repeating them in my mind like a mantra. The shadows hesitated. "You don't get to win," I growled, standing up straighter. I grabbed the journal and slammed it against the wall where the shadows had gathered. The vibrations intensified, and a piercing sound filled the air. The figure writhed, its form unraveling into tendrils of darkness that swirled around me, clawing at my mind. I screamed, pushing back with everything I had. My memories, my family, my life. I wasn't going to let it take them. The tendrils faltered, retreating slightly. I pressed harder, reciting every detail I could remember about my life. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The shadows dissolved into nothing, leaving the room eerily silent. My knees gave out, and I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. But I didn't feel victorious. The office was still cold, still heavy, and my head still felt like it was full of static. I glanced at the journal, now lying open on the floor. One final line stared back at me, written in bold, shaky letters. It never leaves. It only hides. My heart sank. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't gone. It was waiting, and deep down I knew it wasn't finished with me yet. I didn't go home that night. I couldn't. The office was suffocating, but the thought of bringing whatever this was back to Claire and the kids was worse. So I stayed, sitting in the dark, the journal clutched tightly in my hands. The whispers had stopped for now, but the silence wasn't comforting. It was heavy, oppressive, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. My mind was a fractured mess. I could barely remember Claire's face anymore, let alone my kids. Their names felt like whispers on the edge of a dream. I flipped through the journal again, desperate for answers. The scrawled pages all seemed to lead to one conclusion. There was no winning against this thing. Dr. Ellis had tried. He'd fought harder than I ever could, but in the end, he'd vanished. But there was one line I kept coming back to. It only hides. If it couldn't be destroyed, maybe it could be trapped, contained. The air in the room shifted, colder and sharper, and I knew I was running out of time. I needed to act fast. I gathered every scrap of strength I had left and started pulling together a plan. First, I needed to anchor myself, something to hold on to, something real. I took out my phone and scrolled through the photo gallery. Most of the images were blank now, distorted beyond recognition, but there was one that remained intact, a picture of Claire holding Maddie and Jake in her arms. The photo had been taken on a picnic last summer. I stared at it, committing every detail to memory. Claire's wavy auburn hair, Maddie's toothy grin, Jake's favorite red hoodie. "You're not taking this from me," I whispered. The shadows began to stir again, gathering at the edges of the room. They moved slowly, deliberately, as if taunting me. The whispers returned, louder this time, overlapping and echoing in my skull. "You can't resist." I ignored the voice and focused on my plan. If this thing fed on memories, maybe I could bait it, give it something too tempting to resist. I picked up the journal and flipped to the last blank page. With a pen trembling in my hand, I began writing down everything I could remember about my family. Claire's laugh, Maddie's love for animals, Jake's obsession with dinosaurs. I poured every detail onto the page, feeling the strain as the memories grew harder to pull. The shadows coiled closer, almost within reach. The air buzzed with electricity, and the whispers became deafening. When I finished, I tore the page out and held it up. "This is what you want, isn't it?" I shouted. My voice cracked, but I didn't care. "Come and take it." The shadows surged forward, wrapping around me like a tidal wave. The cold was unbearable, like ice flooding my veins. The whispers became screams, but I held the page tightly, refusing to let go. "You don't get to take me!" I roared, my voice echoing against the walls. The shadows lashed out, pulling at the page, at me. I could feel it clawing at my mind, desperate to take everything I had left. And then I made my move. With the last ounce of strength I had, I shoved the page into the journal and slammed it shut. The shadows recoiled instantly, writhing and twisting as if in pain. I grabbed the leather cord that had been tucked in the drawer, likely left behind by Dr. Ellis, and tied it tightly around the journal, sealing it closed. The room erupted in a blinding flash of light, and the shadows let out a final, guttural scream before vanishing completely. When the light faded, the office was silent. The cold was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. I collapsed into the chair, my body trembling, my mind a hollow shell. I looked down at the journal in my lap. The leather felt warm, almost alive, as if it was pulsing faintly. Whatever the entity was, it was in there now. Trapped, for now. I locked the journal in the desk drawer and walked out of the office, leaving the lights off behind me. The morning sunlight felt foreign, harsh as I stepped outside. I blinked, trying to ground myself in the present, but the emptiness inside me was undeniable. Claire's face was gone from my mind, a shadow of a memory. I could still see Maddie and Jake, but just barely. Their laughter, their voices, it was like trying to recall a dream after waking. When I got home, Claire greeted me with a relieved smile. "Where have you been? We've been worried sick." I stared at her, unable to form the words. I wanted to say something, anything, but the connection between us felt severed. I had a long night, I managed, forcing a smile. I kissed her cheek and hugged Maddie and Jake, holding on a little longer than usual. They felt real, but the warmth of their presence only made the loss in my chest more unbearable. That evening, I called the building's owner and ended my lease. "Why the sudden move?" he asked. "It's not a good fit," I replied, my voice hollow. As I packed up the office, I left the journal behind, locked in the desk where I'd found it. Someone else would find it someday, I was sure of that, but not me. I couldn't face it again. When I walked out for the last time, I turned the key in the lock and didn't look back. The shadows may have been gone, but they'd taken something I'd never get back. And as much as I wanted to believe I'd beaten it, a part of me knew the truth. It wasn't over. It was just waiting for its next victim. When I first found the apartment, it felt like fate. A quiet place in Baltimore, cheap rent, just a short walk from the cafe where I liked to write. It was exactly what I needed to finish my book, my first real chance to prove to myself that I wasn't just some hack with a keyboard. I was finally going to get this done. No distractions, no excuses. The building was old, the kind of place that creaks and groans when the wind hits it just right. The landlord, Mr. Hargrove, was this wiry guy in his 70s with a permanent scowl etched into his face. He didn't say much when he handed me the keys, just grumbled about paying rent on time and keeping the noise down. That was fine by me. I wasn't there to make friends. The apartment itself was fine, nothing special. A little musty maybe, but the floors were solid, and the windows let in plenty of light during the day. It had this long hallway that led to the bedrooms, with the kitchen and living room branching off to the side. One of the rooms at the end of the hall was locked when I first moved in, but I figured it was just a storage closet or something. At first, everything felt normal. I spent my days clacking away on my laptop and my nights reading over what I'd written. But then, about a week in, I started noticing something odd. I'd hear these faint noises coming from the locked room, soft, almost like whispers. Sometimes it was just a creak, like the floorboards shifting, but other times it sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate. I tried to ignore it. Old buildings make noises. That's what I told myself. But one night, I was sitting on the couch, and I heard this sound, scratching, like fingernails dragging against wood. I grabbed a flashlight and headed down the hallway. My heart was pounding, but I kept telling myself it was probably just a raccoon or something that had gotten in through the walls. When I got to the end of the hall, though, the locked door was gone. I stood there, blinking at the blank wall where the door should have been. For a second, I thought I'd imagined the whole thing, but I could feel it. This weird pressure in the air, like the hallway was holding its breath. The scratching stopped. I backed away, my palms sweating, and went back to the couch. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I called Mr. Hargrove. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "That locked room at the end of the hall. What's in there?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "There's no locked room," he said finally. "What are you talking about? I saw it." "You're mistaken," he snapped, his tone sharp. "You're paying for a one-bedroom apartment. There's no second room. Don't call me about this again." He hung up before I could say another word. I spent the rest of the day trying to convince myself he was right. Maybe I'd just been tired, working too hard, letting my imagination get the better of me. But that night, as I was lying in bed, I heard it again. Scratching, faint but unmistakable. This time I didn't go down the hall. The next day I tried to put it out of my mind. I told myself I'd just focus on my book, bury myself in the work. But as I was moving my desk closer to the window, one of the floorboards popped loose. Underneath, there was a folded piece of paper, yellowed and brittle with age. I opened it carefully, the edges crumbling in my hands. The writing was jagged, almost frantic, as if whoever wrote it was in a hurry. It said, "The room is your mirror. You can't run from yourself." I stared at the note, my stomach twisting into knots. I didn't know what it meant, but I could feel it. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I couldn't stop staring at the note. The words felt alive, crawling across my brain like insects. "The room is your mirror. You can't run from yourself." What the hell was that supposed to mean? I spent the whole day pacing the apartment, trying to make sense of it. The more I thought about it, the more the sounds I'd been hearing started to gnaw at me. Scratching, footsteps, whispers, and then the door disappearing. I wasn't crazy. I knew what I'd seen, or what I thought I'd seen. By nightfall, I was exhausted but too wired to sleep. I sat at my desk, staring blankly at my laptop screen, the cursor blinking on the same sentence I'd been rewriting for days. It was supposed to be the book that finally put me on the map, but now it felt like the words were slipping through my fingers. That's when I heard it again. This time it wasn't scratching. It was footsteps, heavy, deliberate. They started faint, like they were coming from deep within the walls, but they grew louder, closer, until they were right outside my bedroom door. I froze, gripping the edge of my desk. My breath caught in my throat as I turned toward the door. The room was dark, save for the pale glow of my laptop screen, but I could see the shadow beneath the door, a long dark shape that didn't move. "Who's there?" I managed to croak, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. The shadow shifted slightly, and then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I decided I couldn't handle this alone. I called a handyman from a local flyer I'd found in the lobby, a guy named Chuck who showed up wearing a grimy baseball cap and carrying a toolbox that looked older than me. "You said there's a locked room?" he asked, squinting at me as I led him down the hall. "Yeah," I said, pointing at the wall where the door had been. "It was right here." Chuck frowned, running his hand over the smooth surface. "Buddy, there's no door here. Never was. This wall's solid." "No, it's not," I snapped. "I've seen it. I've heard noises coming from inside." He gave me a look like I was a couple cards short of a full deck, but humored me anyway, tapping along the wall with the handle of his screwdriver. It sounded solid, just like he said. "Look, I don't know what to tell you," Chuck said, shrugging. "Old buildings make noises. Maybe you're just hearing the pipes." I wanted to yell at him, to tell him he was wrong, but the words caught in my throat. What was I supposed to say? That a room was appearing and disappearing like some kind of magic trick? He'd think I was insane. "Thanks," I muttered, shoving a wad of cash into his hand. "I'll figure it out." After he left, I stood there, staring at the wall. My fingers brushed against the spot where the door had been, but it was smooth, solid. That night, the sounds came back, louder this time. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, as the footsteps marched up and down the hallway. Every creak, every shuffle sent a chill racing down my spine. Then came the whispers. They weren't faint anymore. They were clear, like someone was standing right outside my door. I squeezed my eyes shut, pulling the blankets over my head, but it didn't help. The voices weren't words exactly, more like fragmented sentences, distorted and warped, and they were growing louder. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I jumped out of bed and stormed down the hallway, my heart pounding in my ears. "Enough!" I shouted. "What do you want from me?" The hallway was empty. The door was back. It stood at the end of the hall, black and imposing, as if it had always been there. My legs turned to jelly, and I had to grip the wall to keep from collapsing. The air felt thick, heavy, and the whispers were still there, quieter now, but coming from behind the door. I stumbled back into my room and slammed the door shut, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. When I turned on the light, I noticed something on my desk, something that hadn't been there before. It was an old notebook, the cover cracked and faded. I flipped it open and my stomach twisted into knots. The pages were filled with frantic, jagged handwriting, words and phrases repeated over and over. "It knows. You can't hide. The door is waiting." But what really stopped me cold was the last page. It wasn't just writing anymore. It was a drawing, a rough sketch of the door with a name scrawled above it, Emily. My hands started shaking so hard I almost dropped the notebook. Emily was my ex-girlfriend. She'd been missing for 2 years, and now her name was here. I slammed the notebook shut and shoved it into a drawer, but I couldn't unsee it. The door wasn't just a door. It was a threat, and it was waiting for me. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The door at the end of the hallway loomed in my mind, even when I shut my eyes. And Emily's name, seeing it scratched above that sketch, it was like a nail being driven into my skull. She was the one thing I'd spent the last 2 years trying to forget, and now it was like the apartment itself was forcing me to remember. By morning, I'd made a decision. I couldn't live like this anymore. I had to face whatever was behind that door, no matter how insane it sounded. I grabbed a flashlight, my phone, and a kitchen knife. Not that I had any idea what a knife would do against whatever this was. The hallway felt different that morning. The air was thick, like walking through molasses. The usual morning light filtering through the windows was dimmer, grayer. And the door? It looked darker than I remembered, like the black paint was drinking in the light around it. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the door. My hand trembled as I reached for the knob, half expecting it to burn me or disappear the second I touched it. But it didn't. It was cold, almost freezing, like grabbing a chunk of ice. I turned the knob slowly, the creak of the hinges echoing in the silent hallway. The door swung open, and I stepped inside. The room was wrong. It wasn't a room, not really. The walls were lined with mirrors, floor to ceiling, each one slightly warped like funhouse glass. My reflection stared back at me from every angle, but something was off. In some mirrors, I looked older. In others, my face was distorted, stretched into unnatural shapes. The door slammed shut behind me, and when I turned around, it was gone. Just another mirror in its place, showing me a reflection of myself standing there, holding the knife with white-knuckled hands. The air in the room was heavy, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. And then the whispers started again. This time they weren't coming from outside. They were inside the room, inside my head, overlapping and tangled. "Liam, you can't hide. She knows." "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The echoes of my own voice bounced around the room, distorting until it sounded like a chorus of people mocking me. The mirrors started to change. The reflections shifted, no longer just me standing there. They showed scenes, memories, moments I'd buried so deep I didn't think I'd ever see them again. Emily was in every single one. I saw her laughing on our first date, the way her nose crinkled when she smiled. I saw her sitting on the couch in my old apartment, her legs tucked under her as she read one of her favorite books. And then I saw the fight. It was the night she disappeared, the night I'd told myself I'd forgotten. But the mirrors wouldn't let me forget. We were screaming at each other, our words sharp and venomous. She accused me of lying, of keeping secrets. She was right, of course, but I wouldn't admit it. I could see the moment she decided to leave, the way she grabbed her coat and stormed out the door. But the mirrors didn't stop there. They showed me chasing after her, grabbing her arm, pulling her back. I could see the anger on my face, the fear on hers, and then the push. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "That's not how it happened." The whispers grew louder, more insistent. The mirrors began to close in, the warped reflections bending and twisting around me. "Liar. You pushed her. You killed her." "No!" I screamed, slamming the knife against one of the mirrors. It shattered into 1,000 pieces, but the shards didn't fall. They hung in the air, suspended like they were waiting for something. And then I saw her. Emily. She stepped out from the largest mirror, her face pale and hollow, her eyes like black pits. She didn't look angry. She looked disappointed. "You let me go," she said, her voice echoing. "You left me there." I stumbled back, my chest heaving. "It was an accident," I stammered. "I didn't mean to." The room began to shake, the mirrors vibrating violently. Emily stepped closer, her movements jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on strings. "You can't run from it," she said. "You can't run from me." I dropped the knife and fell to my knees, clutching my head. The whispers were screaming now, overlapping into a deafening roar. The room started to fold in on itself, the mirrors bending and twisting, pulling me toward the center. Emily's face was everywhere, reflected 1,000 times, each one staring at me with the same cold, empty eyes. "You have to face it," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Tell the truth." Tears streamed down my face as I whispered, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." The room froze. The mirrors stopped vibrating. The whispers went silent, and for a moment, there was nothing but Emily standing in front of me. Her face softened, just a little, and she reached out, her fingers brushing against my cheek. "You can't take it back," she said, "but now you know." The room imploded and everything went black. When I woke up, the world was silent, the kind of silence that presses on your ears, like being underwater. My head throbbed, and my body felt like it had been wrung out and left to dry. Slowly I opened my eyes. I was still in the room, or what was left of it. The mirrors were gone, replaced by walls of endless black stretching out into a void. The only thing grounding me was the floor beneath me, cold and smooth, like polished stone. Emily was gone too. I pushed myself to my feet, unsteady but alive. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned in circles, trying to make sense of the emptiness. There was no door, no way out, just me and the dark. "Is this it?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Am I stuck here?" No answer. I don't know how long I stood there waiting for something to happen. It could have been minutes, hours. Time didn't seem to exist in that place. And then, slowly, I saw it. The faint outline of a door appeared in front of me. It wasn't like the black door from before. This one was white, glowing faintly, like it was waiting for me. My legs felt heavy as I walked toward it, every step filled with dread. Part of me wanted to turn back, to stay in the void forever, but something about the door called to me. When I reached it, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the doorknob, fingers trembling. Whatever was on the other side, I knew it wasn't going to be easy. Taking a deep breath, I turned the knob and stepped through. I was back in the hallway of my apartment. The familiar creak of the floorboards beneath my feet, the faint smell of old wood and mildew. It was all there. But something was different. The door at the end of the hallway was gone. Completely. No trace of it. Just a smooth, unbroken wall. I stumbled toward the living room, my knees weak, and collapsed onto the couch. My chest felt hollow, like a piece of me had been carved out and left behind in that room. It wasn't until I looked at the coffee table that I realized something had changed. My notebook was sitting there, the one I used for my manuscript. I didn't remember leaving it out, but when I opened it, my stomach dropped. The last page had been filled, not with my writing, but with hers. In Emily's handwriting, the words scrawled across the page read, "The truth is yours now. Don't forget it." I slammed the notebook shut, my hands shaking. I couldn't breathe. The weight of what I'd seen, what I'd done, pressed down on me like a boulder. For the next few days, I tried to go back to normal. I told myself it was over, that whatever had happened in that room was done. But deep down, I knew better. The nights were the worst. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sounds to start again. They didn't, but the silence wasn't any better. It was heavy, suffocating, like the apartment was holding its breath, waiting for me to slip up. One morning, I packed my things and left. I didn't tell the landlord. I didn't even leave a note. I just couldn't be there anymore. I rented a room in a cheap motel on the other side of town and tried to move on. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't escape it. The memories, the guilt. I tried writing again, but every time I sat down to work on my manuscript, the words wouldn't come. All I could think about was Emily, her face, her voice, the way she looked at me in that room. Weeks passed, then months. I stopped sleeping, stopped eating, stopped trying. And then, one night, I woke up to a sound I hadn't heard in a long time. Scratching. It was faint, coming from the walls of the motel room, but it was there. I froze, my blood turning to ice. Slowly, I turned my head toward the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed a little darker than they should have been. And there it was, the black door. It was waiting for me. I don't know what happens next. I don't know if I'll open it again, or if I'll finally let it win. But one thing's for sure. You can't run from the truth. It finds you, no matter where you hide. And once you've seen it, you're never really free.